Hello, everybody. Great to see you. I'm here in London, and Tom Hess is in America. And I'm very excited that he's been able to join us because one of my favorite topics is our subject today. And I've learned so much from him on this, in this whole area. So many simple things he said over the years. And I've been like, huh. And it's really developed my own creative practice a lot. So I think this is going to be super interesting for the songwriters among you. And essentially, how I'm going to kick this off is that if you think about a singer-songwriter, or certainly how I used to think about things when I was writing songs, I would think about what words I was going to use, which chords I was going to play, and then I would come up with a tune. And so the words and the chords and the tune, in a way, were always the most obvious aspects. And I would sort of leave the rest a little bit up to chance, but without really wanting to leave it up to chance. It's not like I had deliberately thought, oh, well, I just don't care about these things. I'm just going to play whatever comes out. It's just that I didn't really know to specifically think about them. And if I had known to think about them, I wouldn't have known what to do with them. So there are tons of things we could talk about with melody and lyrics and harmony, and we have and we will and we can. But today, there's also the other things that are maybe less obvious. And I think this is going to be very interesting for anyone who wants to write more or develop their practice. So there's also and all of this is really in the service of making our music more expressive. So that's the goal. It's to make it, to help us translate the emotional content that we want to put in our music via all the possible ways that we can in all the elements that we're doing. So not just the words, not just the melody, not just the chords, but all the possible ways that we could have of injecting more of that and communicating more powerfully. So, you know, perhaps as songwriters, we might start with an idea or a topic or a sort of subject area. We might want to write a breakup song. But a quite good way to connect this with the actual musical elements is to think about drilling down more into exactly what emotion we might be trying to express. So, Tom Hess, how do you think that it might enhance the experience of the listener for us as a composer to really focus on what the emotion is going to be?
Well, for me, my opinion, music is all about emotion or the expression of it. I mean, I know it's not that way for everybody, but for me, I want to express myself, and my goal is to express myself as accurately as possible. So the musical skills that I have and I work on and I acquire and things I've learned and practice are primarily to serve that purpose, to try to help develop the skills to be more accurate at expressing whatever it is that I'm trying to express. In terms of your question specifically about how being more expressive helps the listener, I think it makes it more interesting. I think for a lot of listeners, they want to kind of get inside the mind of the writer or of the player or the singer or whatever to understand beyond the surface level, what is the intention here? So I don't know about how it is for other people, but for me, I like knowing background, the backstory of what inspired the writing of the song, what the song is really about, especially if the lyrics are not explicitly clear about what the intent is. And you have to kind of try and interpret, what does this mean? What did it perhaps mean to the writer? What does it mean to me as a listener? I think that the more we try to express, the more depth there is for the music, to the music and for the listener. I think just adds a lot. And certainly for me as a listener, it adds a tremendous amount. I don't particularly care for music that doesn't seem to express much, or at least if it does express something, I'm unable to pick up on it. What are your thoughts on that, Deanna?
Well, I think it's really interesting because in a way, you made a comment about appreciating depth in the music that you like. And I often think about what is it that we get out of listening to music? If I'm at a concert or a gig and I'm singing and I'm really into it, what is it that's happening that's making it good for me? And I think everyone's going to have their own answer, but it's really a question that's worth exploring. And part of it is when you talk about depth, we could correlate that with internal space. Part of it is experiencing our own reaction in a powerful and recognizable way. Because if you're in a situation where you know what it is that you're feeling, there's something very relieving about that. Even if what you're feeling is sadness or, even if it's a difficult emotion, it's still a relief to know what it is that you feel rather than to be numb. Like being numb is the not knowing what it is that you feel is a hard and difficult place to exist. And so even in kind of sort of pop culture, we go and see a, I don't know, a horror movie or something, having emotions elicited within us clearly is relieving on some level. And so it's something about an internal space that we are facilitated in exploring. And I think one barrier to us, using even before we know what musical tools may be available to us to make our work more expressive, the first step is being able to identify what emotion it is that we want to express. And that is sometimes not that easy. There are some suggestions that I have, but I wonder what you think about that, or maybe what you do to, whether you find it difficult, whether it's always very clear to you what it is. Because I experience you as someone who's very precise in how they communicate, and I feel like that comes over in your music as well.
Yeah, emotional intention is important to me as a player, writer, improviser, player, all of those sorts of things. Before I get into the answer to the question the way you asked it, let me just preface it by saying this, that when we speak, communicate in verbal language or written language, I think most of the time, want to think about what we want to say before we say it. Sometimes when we just talk without thinking, that gets us into trouble, right? We say things we didn't particularly mean, or we didn't mean it to come off that particular way. Other times we don't say what we really mean and we hold back on things. I think musically, having the known intention of what we want to express before we start, it relieves us from the burden of the abyss of all different possibilities. If I want to express this, that closes a lot of doors of possibilities of things that won't help you to express whatever that feeling or thought or vision is. So it helps to narrow things down, and actually makes the writing a bit easier, I find. And I point this out because sometimes people assume that by having a definite purpose or a definite thing you want to express, recognizing that certain doors, musical doors, expressive doors will close, that might seem on the surface to be restrictive. But I find that it opens up possibilities, because within what's left, you now are focused on what is the most accurate way I can say what it is I'm trying to say. So step one is have something to say. Okay, to have something to say. And for me, I don't just think like I'm going to write a song that is sad. I mean, that's too vague. So stories or things we want to say generally unfold through time. So our canvas, the canvas for music is time, really. Okay. So I've got a little whiteboard here. If I want to express a story or express some event or some fictional or non-fictional, it's going to take place through time. There's going to be what's happening expressively here, 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 and here. Maybe you've got 3, 4, 5 parts to the song. So where you start here is not necessarily where you're going to end up over here. So knowing what do I want to say at this point, what needs to be expressed at this point, and this point, and this point, and this point, sets now your possible expressive intent on a timeline. Okay. Now, some songs don't work out exactly this way, because you've got a verse and then a chorus, and that chorus may repeat over here, and maybe a double chorus that repeats over there. But you have some sort of framework in which to work with. And at this point, you start thinking about underneath each one, what can I do? And maybe we'll get into this a little later today.
Mm-hmm.
What can I do as a writer or as a player to express whatever is in this box? And now you start thinking about the tools that we have, the things we know, the things we can play, the songwriting concepts, all of those sorts of things. Deanna, I apologize. I lost track of this was all leading up to the answer to your question, and I lost track of what exactly the question was as you asked it.
So it was that whether you find it. So I think if we need a specific and precise emotional starting point, that can sometimes be hard to pinpoint. That the difference of going from a feeling like sadness into a very specific way that's going to be, or context for that. And there are lots of different kinds of sadness. So one of the jobs of the writer is going from the sort of general to the specific. And that can take time. That's where the effort is. One has to define the things. So the more you define them, the more effort it is, the greater the quantity of decisions overall that you're going to have made in these different areas that we're going to see in a minute. But therefore, the more crafted and sculpted the end result is going to be. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it has to sound mannered or it has to sound elaborate. It just means that you've taken care of all the little pieces in it. So I think my question was really about what you do in order to drill down into the emotion specifically, and whether that's something that you find quite easy, or whether you have sort of specific ways when it's hard for you to pinpoint.
Knowing what to say is pretty easy. I never sit here and think, what should I write about today? It's very easy to know what I want to express in details, and then I just plot it out, sometimes in my mind, sometimes on paper, what's occurring in time. So emotional expression through time. And this applies to whether it's a song or a guitar solo, or a longer melody, or a single section of a song, or the whole piece of music, or whatever. But getting back to what you said about taking something general and making it specific, I think the more specific you are, again, the more doors close, but you get closer to what's going to be most effective, or what are the tools that are most that are best suited to express this particular specific emotional thing you're trying to say.
Yeah, and I also think if one does not do that, it's a little lazy.
I think so. Well, and I would, yes.
As in in a way, the more decisions that you make in the more areas, the greater care you are taking of the people listening, because you've basically prepared all of these things for them to experience and the more detail you go into, the more there is for them to receive.
Yeah.
But that's perhaps slightly less provable thing. But so let's imagine that we have our emotion and we know what it is we want to express. Is it fair to say that there's a correlation between the listener's experience of emotion and the musical levers of tension and release? And I'm thinking here again about a really simple example. You imagine the horror movie, the phone's ringing inside the house. We can all imagine the kind of music we're going to hear, and it does make us feel tense, and that does make us feel nervous about about Pennywise who's about to pop out of the drain or something like this. I can't do horrors. I'm too jumpy, but therefore I don't know where he drops out of, but whatever. Is that, it might be a little reductive, but is that a fair premise for us to then move on to how we would do that we can use the idea that tension and release are going to create an experience that we turn into a feeling, a perception of emotion?
Yeah, I think so. I think that there is a correlation between the listener's experience of emotional intensity and the building and release of musical tension. And you mentioned, movies. A horror movie was your example. But I think that as we think about this, we need to include the writer's, songwriter, composer's intention as much as we can, and the accuracy of expression, because these things are crucial in directing the listener's emotional response. So the more that we are particular about exactly what we're trying to say and when and how we're trying to say it, and I'll give you an example in a moment, the easier it's going to be to bring the listener along on the emotional journey, the expressive journey that we're trying to take them. So people can have listeners can have an inaccurate or unintended emotional response if we are not accurate in our expressiveness when we write. So when that happens, in a sense, the music is not successful, at least in my opinion. It's not successful in terms of expressive accuracy. So to think about it, an example like this, we take a movie, regardless of what the scene is, it could be a sci-fi movie or a horror film, or it could be a dramatic scene, sad scene, traumatic. It could be an action film, whatever it is. Film composers tend to be really good at accurately expressing what it is that's trying to be expressed, not only in the music, but in the film. That their entire job is to take the story, take what's on screen, and amplify the emotion. If you watched the movie and you took the movie out, took the sound out, and you were just listening to people talk, it wouldn't have the impact that it does. The music is there as an amplifier. It just adds a zero to whatever the film or the scene is about. So those composers, the good ones at least, tend to be very good at accuracy, at being really accurate in expressing what the director is trying to express in that part of the film. If they're not, if the music is not very accurate, well, then there's a dissonance between what the director is trying to say and what the writer originally wrote and what we as an audience perceive. It's supposed to be really sad, but people aren't all that sad. It's supposed to be really scary, and people aren't all that scared. That's a failure in the sense of the expressive accuracy. So tension helps to express all kinds of emotional impact on the listener. The emotional intent of the writer.
So if we're going to use the idea that, we've got these levers of tension and relief, and that is going to create the basis for an emotional experience in the listener, the next question is going to be, what are some ways that we can create and release tension in our songs, perhaps aside from the most obvious ones that we mentioned at the beginning, the lyrics, the melody, and the harmony. We don't need to exclude them, but we might start with some of the other ones that people may not necessarily think of that often or that naturally or in the first case. So something I never used to do was think very much about rhythm. I was all over the loads of chords, and there was one particular song that had tons of chords in it, and I was like, why does this feel like it's quite repetitive, even though there's a lot of harmonic variety? And I realized that I was starting the vocal melody in the same place with the same rhythm and the same spacing all the time. So even though the song had a lot of different chords, there was like a rhythmically repetitive effect that was sort of watering down the contrast that I wanted to achieve in the other elements. So I think rhythm is something that I've become very fascinated with, because it acts really directly on our emotions. If you hear a slow thud and then the thud gets faster, you can't help but be like, wow, what's happening? So it acts on us in this really direct way, but we tend not to, unless we have a enlightened teacher, or perhaps we've learned the drums or something, we tend not to think of it in the first instance. So I think it's something that we can get a lot out of by just using some fairly simple approaches. What are some of your favorite ways to use rhythm to create and release tension?
Excellent question. So let me draw you another picture. Let's imagine we've got, to keep things really simple, okay, let's imagine we've got a steady stream of eighth notes. These could be quarter notes, eighth notes, sixteenths. It doesn't matter. But for this example, they're just pulses, okay? I'll just consider these eighth notes. Now, if we're in 4/4 time, you're going to have an accent here. You'll probably have an accent here. Then you'll have an accent on the start of the next measure, which would be there, okay? This just continues on forever. So you have an accent on 1 and 3. If a drummer is playing, there's probably going to be the accent on 2 and 4. Okay, this is typical. Now, if you set up a pattern, let's erase this over here. So let's say we've got this 4/4 measure. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4. Those are where the typical accents are. If you displace, if you move where the accents fall, that immediately disrupts the pattern that the listener expects to hear. Okay. So for example, if we rearrange these accents, we still got the same eighth notes, but now we have this. Now we have what's called an asymmetrical 4/4 measure. We've got 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. So it's 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. So those accents, those beats don't come at where it's expected to come. It's not 1, 2, 3, 4. It's 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. So simply shifting where accents fall is going to create either more tension or less tension. And you don't have to change the rhythm, the divisions. The eighth notes can stay the same. You don't have to change the time signature. You're simply just regrouping where all the eighth notes are being accented. Okay. And this is what happens when you go into odd meter 7/8 or 5/4 or something like that, that naturally happens because obviously the beats cannot be in the same place that they would normally be in 4/4 time. So now when you're in an odd meter, you're setting up a new pattern. It's more than simply we have 7/8 notes instead of 8/8 notes, or we have 5/4 notes instead of 4/4 notes. It's not about how long the measure is that makes odd meter feel different. It's not its length. It's not the number of eighth notes or number of quarter notes. It's how the beats are grouped. And that change of the grouping of the beats is what gives those other time signatures its different feel. And in 4/4, in this example, we have 3 plus 3 plus 2, 3 eighth notes, 3 more eighth notes, 2 eighth notes. Okay, or the equivalent. This could be a dotted quarter, and 2 eighth notes or a quarter or whatever. So you hear this in rock music all the time. And where you normally hear this rhythm is right before that section of the song is going to change to the next section. So if this was the verse of the song and that's the chorus, you're very likely to hear it right here, right at the end, the last measure, or maybe the last two measures of the verse before we go into the chorus. You're more likely to hear it right here than you are to hear it somewhere over here. I mean, you could hear it anywhere. It's possible anywhere. As a writer, you can put it wherever you want, but it's usually happening before the next part of the song occurs. Why? Because you're signaling two things. One, you're signaling that this part is coming to an end and something else is coming. Okay, so you're sort of foreshadowing that we're moving into another part. But in addition, you're trying to get some separation between whatever this is and whatever that is. So you're disrupting this pattern, because if this is typical 4/4, and if that's a typical 4/4 rhythm, and you break it up with 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2, or 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 1 2, something like that, then it creates a lot of stress. And then you land on the downbeat in this measure. You hear this all the time in songs, rock songs, metal songs. It's very, very, very common without having to leave the 4/4 time signature. So that's a pretty easy thing that people can do. To give you another example of this, if we go to a different time signature, let's say 3/4 time. So in 3/4 time, we'd have 1 and 2 and 3 and, right? That's the length. We've got 6 eighth notes here. So in 3/4 time, you've got this. 1, 2, 3, 1 and 2 and 3 and 1 and 2 and 3 and. But if we simply shift, if we move where the accents fall, these are the accents here. If we erase some of this, instead of 3 accents, if we have only 2 accents, and now we have 1, 2, 3, and then 1, 2, 3. And if you don't know what that looks like, this is 6/8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So the only difference between 6/8 and 3/4 is that 6/8 has 2 symmetrical beats. They're a dotted quarter long each. In 3/4, you have 3 beats that are a quarter each. So you've got 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So if you go from 3/4 to 6/8, you have 2 things happening simultaneously. You have a feeling of slowing down because there's more time now between the beats. Now keep in mind, we haven't slowed anything down. The eighth note pulse is still happening. The tempo has not slowed. We're not playing any slower. It's the same speed, but we have a sense of pulling back. But because the accents fall in unusual places, it also creates stress that pushes us forward. So again, you might find, going back to our example, if this was 3/4 and this is 3/4 and that's 3/4, you might find 6/8 right here to create what's called the hemiola effect. Hemiola just means it's an alternation of 3/4 and 6/8, and it creates a lot of stress. And you can do the same thing in reverse order. If this was all 6/8 and then you went to 3/4, now you have beats happening more frequently. You feel again like you're pushed forward. So those are some pretty simple examples you can do with rhythm without changing the speed, changing the divisions, in this case, the eighth notes. You're just regrouping where the beats are. It's the most simple thing you can do. And it's very, very, very effective. Very effective.
I love these ideas because they're things that one could easily do in a solo arrangement. You could do them if you're playing and singing by yourself. You could do them in a guitar solo. When you have other collaborators, you could create those effects between you. So and I think it's if we don't necessarily, one of my favorite songs that I've ever written has a 7/8 section and a 4/4 section. The 4/4 section is the chorus. 7/8 section has this kind of like urgent feel, and then it kind of expands into the chorus, and there's a sense of release. I would never have written naturally in 7/8 because when you learn how to play guitar, you don't learn 7/8 right away. So you tend to, if you just leave it to your own sort of impulse or instinct, you're going to write things that are familiar and easy to play for you. And something in an uneven time signature is never going to feel natural to play. So you have to you have to have these almost contrived exercises to get you to a point where you can play in those different time signatures so that you have the capacity to then combine them. Otherwise, it's not an artistic choice that's available to you. So I love the way of doing that, which means you don't have to change time signatures. But I also enjoy when one does actually completely change time signatures. So yes, what about if we thought about, and before I move on, would you say that stress is analogous to tension? Does stress help us build tension, rhythmical stress?
Yes and no. I mean, yes, stress helps build tension, but the opposite is not necessarily true. We don't need additional stresses. Let me think, get my words together in my head here. We can create stress and tension by shifting around where beats are rhythmically.
Mm-hmm.
We can also do it by doing exactly the opposite, which is playing nothing. So if we inserted a space here between, let's say, the first part of the song and the second part of the song, and by the way, this is super common today. It's kind of a fad at the moment in popular music. But if you inserted 2 seconds of silence, okay, so you got the verse, instead of from the verse going into the chorus, it builds up and then it stops, total quiet for a second or two, and then this part starts. This silence creates a lot of tension, even though the silence does. We're not doing anything. We're taking everything away, and that's building a lot of tension here before we go to the next part. You hear it all the time. Radio music is filled with this now, the last 5 or 10 years or so. But it's very effective.
So we're saying that we're not saying that tension is only caused by stress, but stress can cause tension.
Yes. Yes.
Cool.
Before we leave rhythm, I'm not sure how long you want to stay on rhythm, but I wanted to just say a couple of other things. You mentioned odd meter, and that when people learn to play guitar or whatever other instruments, we typically learn, stuff in 4/4 first. And if you do that for a long time, other time signatures like 11/8 or 7/4 or 5/4 or 5/8 might seem odd and really weird. They seem unfamiliar when you're playing them, but they're not really all that unfamiliar when you hear them. So here's an easy way to get comfortable playing an odd meter where it doesn't seem weird or feel weird, and that is simply to play or create or improvise in groups of 2 or 3. And you can alternate those groups of 2 or 3 any way that you want. So, for example, if I go out and draw a bunch of eighth notes again, and if we just group them together, maybe we'll do 2 and then 3 and then 3 and then 2. We've got 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2. If that you don't like that rhythm, you can simply change it. You can do this. You can do 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 3 1 2. You can flip it upside down. 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 3. Now I've got 5/8 measures. But you don't have to really sit here and count to 5 or count to 11, or, if you want to play in 15, 16, you don't have to count to 15. It's just usually groups of 2 and 3, sometimes a group of 4, occasionally a group of 5. But larger time signatures tend to be broken up into small groups of 2 and 3, sometimes 4, etc. So if we erase this one, we've got now a 7/8 measure. 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 1 2 3 1 2. Okay, or 7/8 is a little bit more commonly played this way: 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 1 2. Or you can flip it over: 1 2 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 1 2 3. So again, the accents fall in places that are not symmetrical. Here it's a quarter note long, here it's a quarter note long, here it's a dotted quarter long. But it's an easy way to if you're unfamiliar with odd meters, to just experiment in groups of 2 and groups of 3 and just rearrange them in any order you want. If you listen to the movie Lord of the Rings, the final movie, the Return of the King movie, there is a scene, it's a battle scene, where all the bad guys, all the orcs, go marching up to do battle. And there's a long sequence in the war drum parts where it's alternating between 2s and 3s, not always in the same order. And it very much sounds war-like when you hear it. And that the composer there took that from a Gustav Holst piece named Mars, which is in 5/4 or 5/8. But it's that alternation of 2s and 3s create that very tense warlike feeling. That wasn't a mistake. That when the composer for the Lord of the Rings film score wanted to try to exaggerate the feeling of this war march, that he used the exact same rhythmic device in those war drums, and you get that effect, and you feel it when you hear it right away. Had he tried to get that same effect in 4/4, 1 2 3 4, it would have been lost. It would not have worked as well. So it's a simple little rhythmic device that has a massive impact on how the listener, or in this case the movie viewer, experiences the scene.
I love the idea of playing in groups 2 and 3 and thinking of it like that, because I'm definitely the person that was like 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 1 2 3 4 5 6 7, which doesn't even work because 7 has 2 syllables and that throws you all off, even
Yeah,
if you speak
exactly.
real quick like me.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a much better way of doing it than I did it. And I also love the Lord of the Rings example. That's a perfect illustration of how we experience, how tension gives us a certain experience emotionally. One of the other things that I think affects our feeling of tension and release or build is the dynamic that we experience. And I'm sure you've seen bands that confused dynamic with volume. I've definitely played in
Sure.
some of those bands, and
Yeah.
their attitude to dynamic is just being loud. But and they really want to create that same intensity that, for example, perhaps like that warlike intensity, and they try and do it by being loud, and it doesn't really land. It doesn't really create that kind of like that emotion doesn't cut through, and it's not forceful in the way that people are looking for, because they're reaching for it, but they haven't got the experience or the technique or the knowledge to know how to actually to produce that effect. And I wonder, I mean, in a way, it sort of seems obvious to suggest that the dynamic has got a relation to the volume. Like volume is one of the things that gives us a sense of changing dynamic, but they're not the same things. And also that the dynamic level is going to affect our perception of what the emotion is. High dynamics are going to, it's not necessarily, they're not going to correlate, I guess, in a totally they're going to maybe amplify wherever it is that we've got to with the other elements. So I don't think we can say a low dynamic is always going to be sad, or a high dynamic is going to be aggressive or whatever. But what do you think are some ways that we could we can think about dynamic to help us make the most of let's say that we had some rhythmic tension in place and we had sculpted something like that going from one section to another? What are some other ways that we could think about changing the dynamic level apart from just volume?
Yeah. So this is a great topic, and I like what you said in the beginning about some bands trying to use volume alone to communicate power. And it's not really volume on its own which can communicate power. I mean, generally speaking, louder dynamic levels tend to feel more powerful than softer ones. But there's way more to it, or way more that could be there to it than just the volume. And really, it comes down to contrast. So if you play loud all the time, the listener gets immune to that effect. And that's true with any musical element. If you use the same musical elements in the same way all the time, the listener just gets used to it as this is just the standard. This is just what it is. And if it's loud all the time, people might just turn it down a little bit, because it just takes away everything you've tried to build using volume alone gets taken away when someone turns it down. So it's really the contrast, the change between leading up to the loud high volume, which is going to be so much more impactful. That change. If you don't have parts that are lower, you have nowhere to go. Everything's at 10. You can't go to 11. This is not Spinal Tap. It doesn't go to 11. So the change, I think it's more effective when there are moments when things are down a level. On guitar, for example, I'll just use my acoustic guitar here. If I play at the same dynamic level, right now I'm palm muting, right? Now, it might sound like when I took my palm off and I'm not palm muting, like it got louder. It didn't get louder. Let me say that again. It did not get louder. What you're experiencing is the openness of the sound. The timbre changed. So there's a contrast in timbre. That time, I actually played a slightly quieter when the palm came off the bridge. Now it's a lot quieter when I release the palm, so I'm not doing palm muting anymore. But you have a more open sound, and that adds to the difference of dynamic level. Now we can certainly play quieter here. We can do that, and now it not only did the sound open up, but it also got louder. But we have multiple elements happening here. It's not just louder for the sake of volume. So that adds, I'm using timbre as well as loudness to help extend more contrast in the dynamic range. If you only went for volume, it's not as powerful. Something else you can do is if you have reverb on drums or on guitars or whatever, and you want to give the illusion of distance, you add more reverb. If you want to add proximity right in your face, you pull the reverb back. Okay. So for example, if you wanted to give the appearance of something being louder, one of the things that helps do that is clarity. Well, reverb it's a very cool effect, but the more reverb that's added, the less clear everything is. So if you wanted to have things go up, you might pull the reverb back so that the signal is drier, less wet is what they call it, less reverb on. And that will help you as you're going up in volume with a decrease in reverb. It gives the appearance, gives the feeling of something moving closer to you. So not only are you maybe going up in volume, but you appear to be coming closer in proximity. And that gives the listener an overall feeling of something is getting more intense. It's getting bigger because it's now getting a little louder and it's more open and it feels like it's getting closer. Another way to do that is when recording is to move the microphone closer to the source. That will make it not only louder because it's closer, but it also amplifies lower frequencies. It's called the proximity effect when you're miking an amp cabinet or anything else. So you'll experience a difference in volume as it comes closer to the source, but you also experience the proximity effect. So I'm not sure how well that picked up over the internet here, but if we were recording that, you would have heard lower, deeper bass frequencies. It would sound closer as the bass frequencies went up relative to the others. So those are some small things that you can add to the simply the difference of, you know, volume levels. On electric guitar, if you roll off the volume, of course, you're turning something down, but you're turning the volume down a little bit. But if you're using an amplifier with a lot of gain, a lot of distortion, that volume isn't really going down that much. If you turn the volume knob on your guitar from 10 down to 5, you haven't really reduced the volume coming out of the amplifier much at all, because the distortion from the amp is compressing that sound to remain at a pretty high level. But what you do is you decrease some of the gain, and that cleans it up a little bit and makes it sound quieter than it is. It's a little bit of an illusion there. So reverb adds distance or takes away distance. Proximity of microphones adds or decreases not only volume, but the proximity effect, how close something appears. And then, tones on the guitar, rolling off the mic, palm muting, open sound versus closed sound, all of those things add to what you can do with dynamic range. It's not, as Deanna said, it's not just turning everything up or turning everything down. But the main thing I could say is contrast is more important than going for the maximum effect, because if you're at 10 all the time, it loses. The listener just gets used to that, and it loses power. But as soon as there's a contrast, they have no choice. They are forced to pay attention to the power surge. They can't not notice it.
Yeah, I love that, because for me, one of the things that I constantly find, even now, is that if I see a recording or hear a recording of myself doing a performance, it's always less contrasted than I think it is. And so this is, I think, some of the easiest ways to create more impact in an arrangement, whether you want to record it or whether you're performing it yourself, is looking at the rhythmical elements and then looking at the amount of contrast. And you can only really do that effectively by having some form of recording that you can monitor. So that's, I think that the contrast thing is a really helpful way for people to be able to think about it. And because it also makes it a lot more straightforward to look at the guitar and see where the opportunities for contrast are within that, in terms of maybe how many strings you're using, how you're articulating it. It is the example you gave of going from muted to an open ringing sound on the acoustic guitar. How many notes are we hearing at once? And again, with anything that's muted, there's the opportunity to do a lot of interesting things with the accents in the way that you talked about earlier. And these are, I always love things that can help us be more expressive when we're on our own, but we can also quite easily imagine how, if you had one other musical collaborator with you, those elements could then be brought in by that other person. So these are things that one could do in a solo arrangement, but you could also use them quite effectively with two people, or in a recording where you have the opportunity to do multiple parts. And I also loved what you said about the options for creating dynamic effects using recording techniques. And one can imagine that if you did that, the more instruments you've got, the more opportunity there is to do that across to sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Exponentialize that.
Mm-hmm.
Not a word, but never mind. So that's super interesting. And what are your, I think if I'm looking for a quick way to make something, to, I guess, low-hanging fruits way to make an arrangement sound more convincing, I look at the rhythm in terms of how in time it is. Of course, because sometimes if we're doing a lot of things at the same time, especially if we're singing and playing, we can not notice that we've kind of gone out of time in a certain section. Or if we're changing guitar parts, we may not realize that we're consistently playing that particular part a little slower than that one, and not in a way that sounds cool. So I like to sort of audit just a rough recording of something for those elements of being in time, and then for the elements of which bits of the guitar am I using, and where could there be more rhythmic interest, either in terms of how many subdivisions we're hearing or what an overall rhythmic pulse is going to be. So what would be some of your favorite, out of all the things we've talked about, some of your favorite ways of sort of low-hanging fruit on an arrangement if you felt like it wasn't quite working?
Well,
or if you were coaching somebody else.
Yeah, there are two things here that come to my mind immediately. The first is layering. So if it's not just you, if it's you and there are other musicians, when you watch a band play live, especially if the band has two guitar players, and especially if it's a rock or a metal band with two guitar players, you usually have both players playing the same thing at the same time, because the idea is to double it, and that's fine. But why do both guitar players have to be playing all the time? That they don't. It's okay if one guy doesn't play anything and the other one does, so that the second guitar, when it comes in, it's adding something. Again, if it's both players are playing at the same time all the time, especially if they're playing the same thing, it loses its effect. You might as well just have one. It loses the impact because it's too much sameness all the time. So if the second player was playing something else, or sometimes doesn't play at all, or they alternate who's playing what, I think there's so much opportunity to add more contrast. So the powerful sections become more powerful because they're perceived as more powerful. And there's just more variety there. So that's sort of the first one in a nutshell. The second one is the use of rubato, which we didn't really talk about yet. And this is really easy to do when you're playing by yourself. There's one player. But with a band setting, an ensemble, you can still use rubato. It requires a little bit more eye contact with everybody else who's playing. Someone's got a lead here. But if I play something without rubato, and then I'll play it with rubato, and by the way, if my guitar is too loud, let me know. So I'm just going to play basically three chords. Okay, I'm going to play B minor, A, and G. I'm going to play them in a little bit of a fancy way, but it's basically just those chords. I'll play it straight. So if I was going to make a song out of those chords, and I have, there are two things I would do very differently. One, for the mood of those chords, in my opinion at least, that was way too fast. Like the chords just kind of go by. I'm kind of just going through the motions. So the tempo is a bit too fast for me. In other words, because the notes are going by so quickly, it's losing the emotional potential that is there. We can extract so much more emotion out of it if we slow this down. And second thing is, if we add rubato, the gradual speeding up and slowing down, so it's not all exactly the same rhythm, we can extract even more. Okay, so here's an example of that. We could say more because first we slowed it down. We've got a rhythm that's more appropriate for these chords, or at least the voicings of those chords. That's helped. Second, it's not all the same rhythm. You speed up, you pull back, you push forward, you pull back. That adds more rhythmic interest, but it also pulls the listener in. They cannot become immune to the rhythm. You force them to pay attention. They have no choice. Even if they're doing something else in the background and they're not really listening, it's like taking your hand through the speaker, grabbing their ear and pulling it here and say, pay attention. Okay. Whereas if it was the same rhythm all the time, they just get immune to it. Rhythmically, it does nothing. It doesn't do anything to help get and keep their attention. And it doesn't, the rhythm isn't doing anything to help express what maybe the harmony is trying to express. So we're now losing, we're not using one of the elements that we have to try to draw this out. Plus, dynamic levels, dynamic contrast goes really well with rubato. So you can either you can either get louder when you speed up, you can get quieter when you slow down, or you can do the opposite. It has a completely different effect. In fact, I would urge everyone to try that. Try it with anything. You know, you as you speed up, get louder, see how that feels. As you slow down, get quieter, see how that feels. And then do exactly the opposite. As you get louder, you get slower. As you get quieter, you go a little faster and see how that sounds. And just simply experimenting with that will open up so many doors. And you might like one more than the other, but try not to choose a favorite. And this was a mistake I made many, many years ago. I had my favorite things that I liked. I like to do these things in this combination because I think that sounds better. And maybe that was better, at least for me, in that particular situation. But I made the mistake of thinking it simply is better when done that way. So I would play everything like that with those elements in combination. And I didn't realize until later, and this is, I mean, I'm almost embarrassed to admit this because this is how dumb this was, this way of thinking, is that just because it was better, that combination of elements in this situation doesn't mean it's always going to be better in other situations. So you got to keep an open mind and try the different combinations to see what works best with what it is you're trying to write or create or improvise or whatever.
Yeah, I love what you said there about essentially almost getting into kind of creative habits. In a sense, what we like, we tend to do more, and that does sort of characterize our style somewhat. But I think there can be a real danger of defaulting to what's familiar. Like we said in the very beginning, when you're, quite new to guitar, certain things are going to be more familiar than other things. But even when you're pretty developed and you have wide skills to draw on, there might be still things that you have used to the point where they're familiar, even if they're complex and advanced. And then you can be more tempted to draw on those. And in a sense, making a distinction between what the effect is that you need to create at that point in your composition and what is in your personal taste could be a very useful one to do. So you're in service of your idea, not just defaulting to your presets. And I also loved everything that we've said about contrast and the point that you made about if we're expanding some of these ideas into how one would use them in a band context, that if you've got two guitarists playing all the time, you might as well just have one. I read somewhere that from the point of view of how our brain works and our systems of cognition, they are basically all evolved around detecting change. Now, I'm definitely not a neuroscientist, so, don't at me. Although I forgot to say at the start of the stream that it would be lovely if you could say hi in the chat and let us know where you're from. So I'm saying that now. So yeah, not neuroscience, but it does make sense. Very COD psychology point of view. If you need to notice when a lion has just walked into the forest so that you can move out of the way, it's going to help if your cognition systems have developed to kind of tell you that. And so it makes complete sense that we need enough contrast to refresh our attention so that we are able to receive the emotional content of the song, because all of these things that we're doing, they also, changes in tension are the kinds of changes that help us keep paying attention. So the fact of there being enough contrast in the composition, as well as us making these decisions about where we might want to create and release more tension, are all things to help us stay present with what's happening in the song. So I love all of those ways of framing it, both as ideas one can use in solo performance for writing songs, melodies, guitar solos, and in terms of how you might then develop those when you've got more musical resources to draw on. So that is fabulous. Lots and lots to think about there. Is there anything that you want people to know on this subject that you have not yet said?
Yeah, actually, I started saying it earlier, but I didn't finish it fully. But let me draw you another little picture here real quick. And I'll leave you all with this. Let's say we've got to remember what we're trying to express is happening through time, right? If the song is 5 minutes long, your canvas is 5 minutes, right? This is what you have. You've got time. Okay. So first, we're trying to decide, what do I want to express here in the beginning? How does what I'm trying to express unfold? Maybe this is a story, maybe it's not a story, but it can't be the sameness the entire time. I mean, I don't think you want the sameness the entire time. So you're trying to express something here. We'll call this A, we'll call that B, we'll call this C, D, and E. Okay. Now you might use some of the materials in A, again in C and in E, or you might not. But the point is that what I do when I'm writing, before I start writing, is I define in normal words, not in musical terms, but in normal words that you could speak to a non-musician and say, here's what I'm basically trying to say. I'm trying to express this here, and then I'm trying to express that, and then this and this. You could tell it to, your neighbor who doesn't play any instruments, and they would understand with words what the basic thing you're trying to express is. Okay. So I define this in normal words. Then I go down, I make a grid like this. Okay. And for each one of these rows is one of the 7 elements of music. So music has 7 elements. Okay. There are 7. There's not 11. There's not 42. There are 7. Okay. We got melody in no particular order. You got melody, harmony, rhythm, texture, timbre, dynamics, and form. Those are the 7. Okay. So for each one, I would be asking the question to myself, okay, if I want to express this, whatever this is, how, using just the element of melody, what can I do melodically to express this? Now, at this point, I don't have to have all the answers. All I have to do is ask the right question. Okay, the question I just asked. Okay, I might make a few notes to myself. I might write them down, things to try when I pick up the guitar, or I go to the computer and start writing things out, or I grab pen and paper and start writing out notes, on paper. Before that, I'm just giving myself quick ideas of things to try. It doesn't mean I have to do those things, but it's a starting point to get some ideas once I get to the actual writing of the music part. Then I'll ask for harmony. What can I do harmonically to express this? Now, fortunately, the more you know about music, the more you know about music theory, the more answers you'll have in here of things that even before you try them, are going to be usually effective at expressing this emotion, this thought, this feeling, or whatever. You do the same for rhythm, for timbre, texture, form, all of that stuff, dynamics. So now you have a little bit of a blueprint. And again, when I teach this, sometimes students think that they're being restricted. Like now they only have to do, or they can only try the things that go in these boxes. No, not at all. These are just starting points, places to begin experimenting from. You don't have to do anything on the list, but you at least should know what things commonly help express this. Okay. Once you know that, you will be able to write music that expresses what you want to express faster, and the result will be more accuracy of what you're trying to express here. So this is a great way to practice writing. And even if you're not trying to write an actual song, you're just going through the practice, is a great way to practice it. And the more that I've done this over the years, the better I've gotten at being able to write music that I like faster and are more accurate for what I'm trying to express. It's opened tremendous doors and enabled me to acquire skills I would not have been able to acquire any other way. So it's a really cool songwriting secret there.
Well, I'm really glad that you decided to share that, because that whole way of thinking about things made a massive difference to me. And it really is an easy and accessible yet ever extendable solution to the thing that I raised at the very start, which is we tend to give like most of our attention to the most obvious elements to us, which are the harmony, the melody, and the lyrics, and then we can lose all the expressive potential that is easily available to us, and all that kind of ability to make things more precise and to communicate more accurately and to make more of a communication with our material to our listener that those other elements can offer us. And we talked about rhythmically grouping the accents and potentially shifting between time signatures and potentially making use of space. There are already 3 things in the category of rhythm. It would not take anyone who's on the stream very long to have 3 accessible things that they could do in each category. The ways available of combining those things is going to make your work so much richer. So I think that's just, you know, I really invite anyone to rewind and like watch that little bit 15 times and then go and do it. So I love this stuff, and I think that there's been so much useful things for people to draw from what you've shared. Thank you very much indeed for coming on and showing us the magic of the whiteboard that we can use and go forth.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Before you guys all go home, I do have something for you. And no, it's not that one. It's that one. This is in terms of how we might think about some of those elements of music, but relative to lyrics, because there's lots of ways you can use rhythm with lyrics, and ways to think about how to structure the melody in lyrics, and how you even go about defining what it is that you want to say. So I said at the very beginning, that's something that can the difference between starting out with a feeling and then creating a song out of it, that can sometimes not be very obvious, because defining a feeling and putting it into words and then creating a trajectory whereby those words lead you along the path of that feeling can be quite hard. So this 5 ways to write great lyrics is all the stuff I wish I'd known when I was starting out, and it would help me an awful lot. And it would save me from my slightly embarrassed surprise in the recording studio the first time a producer kind of like got his red pen and went through stuff, and I was like, he's touching my work. And luckily now I realized that was all for the best. But I would have been much more prepared to know how to think about my work and edit it if I'd known all this stuff to start with. So please do go and help yourselves to that. The link is also in the comment in the description for the live stream. And thank you very much again once more, Tom Hess. And I'm going to look forward to reviewing this material myself.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Deanna. Appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody. And let me just wave goodbye. See you next time.